called Syntax. I really love that podcast. I listen to every episode of it. And on the most recent episode, one of the people on the show, Scott Talinsky, was just gushing about Svelte. And he's creating a course on Svelte right now. So I'm not the only one that's excited about this. If you want to get a copy of my slides, you can go out to this URL. It's my GitHub, mvolkmann/talks. And so there's a bunch of directories out there with various talks. And if you find the Svelte directory, there are 3 files there, 3 PDFs. There's a long and a medium and a short. The long would take me maybe 2 hours to go through. The medium is what I'll go through tonight. Maybe it's 45 minutes, we'll see. And then the short I could do maybe in a half an hour. So we'll go through the medium talk tonight. I've got a pretty long history in doing web development. I started with jQuery, and then I moved on to Angular 1, and then to React. And then for a brief period in there, I did some Angular 6, and then I did some Vue, and now diving into Svelte, but still primarily the thing I do is React. So I hope to convince you tonight that this is something you should consider as an alternative to all of those other frameworks like React and Vue and Angular. And an interesting thing about Svelte is that it's not a library like a lot of the others are, where you're going to build your application and you've got to have this library code going along with you. Instead, Svelte is a compiler. And so what happens is that you write your code in these .svelte files, and then Svelte combines it all together and creates this bundle JavaScript file for you. Svelte itself is implemented in TypeScript. And when you create a project, one of the interesting things you'll notice is if you look at the package JSON, you'll see that all there are dev dependencies. There's no runtime dependencies, and that's because everything you need gets put into the bundle by the Svelte compiler. It also doesn't use a virtual DOM. And this is something that the creator of Svelte thought was really important, Rich Harris. And I have a link to a talk that he gave toward the end where he goes in great detail about why he thinks it's wrong to use a virtual DOM. And of course, that's a hallmark of React, is to use a virtual DOM. So you might find that interesting. And this is not Rich Harris's first web framework. He built another one before this that's called Ractive while he was working at the Guardian newspaper. And they still use it there, but he's moved on to work at the New York Times now, and now has created Svelte. He's also done other important open source work. He's the main author of the Rollup module bundler, and so that's what Svelte uses by default to build the bundle. But if you want, it's easy to configure Svelte to use Webpack or Parcel instead. So I imagine a lot of you have done web development in the past, and the way that I like to learn a new technology is to see a good code example right up front, and then we can talk about the details. So of course I'm going to show the classic to-do app, and I think there's some really interesting features that you'll see in this quick code example. So here's the UI that I want to build. I've got this title up at the top, and then it can tell me how many of my to-dos I still have to complete. 1 of 2 remaining, because that one is marked as done. And once I check them off, at some point I want to clear those out, and so I can archive them. But if I want to add another one, I type in something here and either click the add button, or I can just hit the enter key, and it will add it down here for me. And this part in red, that is a to-do component, and the whole app is a to-do list component. So a to-do component, as you see, just has 3 pieces to it. There's a checkbox, there's the text of the to-do, and a button that I can click to delete it. And if I check it, it changes the font, so it has the strike through and it changes to gray. To start, all I need is this main.js file where I import my to-do list component from a .svelte file, and then I can say I want to create an app using this component, and I'd like that to be rendered in document.body, and then just export that. So that's all I need to kick it off with my top-level component. So before I show you that top-level component, let's look at this one first, the to-do component. And it's going to be very simple, because all I want this to do is to render those 3 things, the checkbox and the text and the delete button. And it's not going to know really what to do if you click the checkbox. And it doesn't know what to do if you click the delete button. Instead, it's just going to send an event out. And the to-do list component is going to be listening for those events, and that's what knows what should happen when those events occur. So I'm going to pull in this create event dispatcher from the Svelte package and then create one of those things. Now I've got my dispatcher. And then this is an interesting line, export. So you probably know what that does in JavaScript. It exports a thing. Usually it's a function, but it could be other kinds of values that you want some other JavaScript file to use. But there are two cases in Svelte where they've decided to take what is a standard part of JavaScript syntax and treat it to mean something different. And this is one of the two. And so what Svelte does is it says, if you say export, you're trying to tell me about a prop. So this component accepts a prop, which is called to do. And your initial reaction is probably, well, you can't do that. JavaScript has said what that means. You can't make it mean something different. To which Svelte would say, this isn't JavaScript. This is a .svelte file. And the compiler is reading this, and it can interpret these things however it chooses. And as I said, there's only two cases like this, so it's not really that bad. But the main point is when you export something, you're saying it's a prop. Notice I've got a script tag here, I've got a style tag, and then just some HTML. So that's the layout of these .svelte files. Put all your JavaScript at the top, then whatever styling you want. And then you don't have to wrap this in anything. It's just whatever HTML you want it to render. And so what Svelte's going to do is it's going to generate JavaScript for this, and it's going to be inserting in lots of event handling and whatever it needs to make this work. And it'll build a component and make it be the default export of this whole file automatically. So I can't really export things anyway because Svelte wants to make the component it generates be the default export. So let's jump down here to the HTML. I want to output a checkbox. So there's my checkbox. And should it be checked now? Well, I get that to-do object passed in that has a couple of properties. One is a done. It's just a Boolean. And then if you click the checkbox to change its state, I'm going to dispatch this event. And I don't need any data going back. I'm just saying I've toggled this component, or this to-do, the one that you passed in. And then here's the text of the to-do right there. And so this is called an interpolation when I put a JavaScript expression inside curly braces. And I'm giving this a class. And that's the key to how the text turns gray and it has strike through if I click the checkbox. Because when I click the checkbox, I'm going to change the done flag to true back in the to-do list component where it's listening for this event. And then it'll feed the to-do back in here because that's a prop. And this class right here is going to be done dash true or false. If it's false, I don't want to do any special styling. But if it's true, that will be the class. And I make it gray with line through. So I'm outputting a bunch of list items. Hopefully to-do list is putting this maybe in an unordered list, and I'll get a bunch of list items inside it. Then I've got the button to delete the to-do. And again, I'm just dispatching an event. This component doesn't know what to do. It's going to let its parent component take care of that. So you see, this is very simple. It's just like a presentational component that can render this HTML for a given to-do object, and it has some styling. I'll repeat this again later, but style in Svelte is automatically scoped to this component. So I don't have to worry about any of this styling escaping out, and I'll describe a little bit later how it actually does that scoping. Okay. Another thing, anywhere inside here, what the name of this component is. I told you I'm calling it to do, but as it turns out, a component definition never says what the name of the component is. It's not until you actually use it in another component where you give it a name. And so here, over in my to-do list.svelte file, I'm importing it. And this is the point at which I say what I want to call it. And another component that imports it could call it something different. So over here, I've got a bit more JavaScript to go through. So everything on this slide is the JavaScript. And then on the next slide, we'll see the CSS. And on the next slide after that, we'll see the HTML that it renders. So I'm going to keep track of the last ID I've used for one of my to-dos. I assign one to each one. And I've got this function for creating a new to-do. You pass in the text, and you could tell me it's already done, but that's not normal. Usually you would omit that argument. And then I'll create this object. So I'm going to bump up last ID, and that's the ID of this one, and it's got the text, and it's got the done. Aren't these shorthand properties that we have in JavaScript now really nice? Who wants to say text colon text? Okay, this is really interesting. These are top-level variables in the script of this component. And it turns out that top-level variables are the state of the component. So if you've done anything in frameworks like, say, React, you've got to do something to tell it what things are the state. But in Svelte, if you declare a top-level variable, that's your state. Even better, if I make a change to those variables, my component automatically re-renders. And so that's the reactive part of Svelte, is you don't have to say anything about what state. You just define some variables, and then you change them, and your component updates. So I want to start with already having two to-dos in my array of to-dos. The to-do text, that's where the user can type in text for a brand new one. These two lines that start with $:, called reactive declarations. So this is JavaScript, has to be valid JavaScript syntax. So what is that? Well, it's a label. Do you know you can label statements in JavaScript, and you can do things like break to a label? Nobody does that in actual code, but that's JavaScript. And so this is just a label whose name happens to be $. And just like the export that we saw on the previous slide, this is the second bit of valid JavaScript syntax that Svelte chooses to treat in a special way. And Svelte says that's a reactive declaration, which means if anything I reference in this line of code is modified, execute this line again. So if I make a change to my array of to-dos, I'm using it right there, it's going to run this again, and I'm going to filter out all the to-dos that are not done and then get the length. That's how many I haven't completed yet. And so this variable will be updated every time that array is modified. Likewise, I wanted to display in the UI, I have this many uncompleted of this many total. Well, that's this line of text here. So I'm using a template literal. And if uncompleted count changes, the value of status is going to change, and I'll fill that in. Likewise, if I change the to-dos array, it's going to get its length again, and that'll cause status to be updated. So this is a bit like a feature in Vue, computed properties. Okay, then I have the functions I'm going to use for event handling. If I type in text for a new to-do and I click the add button, this is going to get invoked, and I'll create a new to-do using that text. My input for the to-do text is going to be tied to that variable. So as you type, that will be changed. And then when this is called, I've already got that text. I create the new to-do, and I'm concatenating it to my array of to-dos and assigning it back. Now you might think, why don't I just use push? And the answer is that this is a case where Svelte won't realize that I've made a change. So to let Svelte know, I've got to actually create a new array. And so that's what I get when I use concat. There's another trick you can use that I'll show you a bit later. And then after I've added the to-do, I'd like to clear out the input where the user typed it in. So if I set to-do text back to an empty string, the input is looking at that, and so it'll clear it out. If I click the archive button, well, deleting them. So I'm filtering out all the ones that are, I'm keeping all the ones that are not done. And I get that new array and assign it back to to-dos. And of course, that's going to make this execute again, and everything gets updated. If I want to delete a specific to-do, I'm passing in the ID of the one I want to delete, and then I do the filter, and I keep all the ones that are not the one I'm trying to delete, and assign it back to to-dos. And then if I want to toggle the state of just one of my to-dos, I'm going to loop through all the to-dos, and if I find the one that's the ID that I want to toggle, see, I'm getting the whole to-do, and then I'm pulling out its ID, and if I find the one that I want to toggle, then what I want to return is a to-do object where I have all the stuff that was in it before, except I want to change done to be the reverse value. But if it's not the one I want to toggle, just keep it the way it is. Okay, so I've got all my kind of utility functions here, and we're ready to look at what I'm going to render. Yes?
Back to the reactive statements with the $ label, that means that the compiler is actually interpreting that code to determine where the dependencies are to know when to fire it?
Right. If you look at the generated code, it's set up to watch all the things that are used in that expression. And if any of them change, that's how it knows to fire again.
The other thing is, apparently, it's kind of counterintuitive, but you can have the same label in
Yes.
code.
Yeah, like why isn't that an error in JavaScript? But it turns out it's not. And so they're just taking advantage of that weird bit of the JavaScript spec.
Well, I guess there is no go-to in JavaScript.
Right.
So it's only used in the context of like a break in a loop or something. So
Right.
it must be why
Yeah.
consider it invalid.
Yeah, there must be a case where there's more than one with the same name and JavaScript has a rule for deciding which one to pick. Maybe the first one in the source file, I don't know.
I wonder if that's susceptible to changing in the future standards.
Yeah, but it won't break this in any case because this isn't actually JavaScript. It's using this to generate JavaScript that would no longer have those labels in it. Okay, so there's not a lot of CSS going on here, just some styling around the button. The main thing is that I am using an unordered list, which normally would give me a bulleted list, but I don't actually want a bullet in front of each of my list items, and so that bit of CSS is just turning off the bullets. Okay, and now we get to the HTML, and this is really the whole app. So I've got my title up at the top, then there's that status that we computed that tells me how many are remaining to complete. Then I've got my archive completed button, and if I click that, I want to call that function. Then I've got a form with all my form controls inside it. And if you submit this form, I want to prevent the default action. So I'm not actually sending it to the server. So you see the nice syntax here that you can attach these kind of modifiers onto event handling to make it do special things like that. And by the way, the reason I'm wrapping all of this in a form, even though I'm not submitting to the server, is that I want it to be the case that if I type into that input and I just hit the enter key, that it'll act just like I had clicked the button. And I get that by wrapping it in a form. Okay, so my input, I automatically have the focus there. It's got a placeholder, and then this is a key piece. I want to bind to the value, and whatever the value of this JavaScript expression is, that's what will be displayed in the input. And when you type into there, it's going to update this. I said JavaScript expression, but it really has to be a variable so that it can update that. The add button should be disabled if I haven't typed any text yet, and that's what that part does for me. And if I click the add button, I want to call add to do that we saw on the previous slide. Okay, so again, if I'm in this input and I hit the enter key, it's going to say, oh, I should submit this. But then it's going to say, well, what's the default, what is the submit thing here? And the type of a button actually defaults to submit. And so it'll act as though I had clicked this button. Okay, then here's my unordered list using this styling, which gets rid of the bullets. And then I want to loop through all of my to-dos. And the way that you do that in Svelte is with this # each. And we'll see a couple more things like this. At first, that might seem kind of jarring, like, is that like mustache syntax? I thought we weren't doing that anymore. But there's only a few of those, and so it's really easy to learn. And what this says is that I've got a collection of things, and I'd like to iterate through them and refer to them each as just to do. And then I can render one of my to-do components that I imported earlier and tell it what the to-do is. And there's actually a shortcut you can take here. If the name of the property is the same as the name of the variable you've got it in, you can remove this part, to-do equals, and just give it that in curly braces, and it does the same thing. Now, how about here? What's a delete event and what's a toggle done event? Well, those were two events that we were emitting from the to-do component. So that's how the parent can listen for events coming from a child. And so I know which to-do you're deleting, so I can just grab its ID and call delete to-do. Or if you toggle done, I know what to-do it is, and I can call toggle done. And we already saw those two functions.
So when the children emit the events, and we have listeners here, do those events stop at that level, or do they keep
They do not propagate. There's a thing that you can do to cause it to go up one more level, but it never just keeps going up all on its own. Yeah, actually, if I just say on delete and I don't give it a value, that is telling it, go ahead and propagate that up to your parent. But because I told it what to do, then it stops here. And this is the end of my each loop. And so there's 3 of these kinds of things. There's an if that we'll look at, and there's also one related to promises. And so they all begin with the pound sign, and they all end with a slash. And sometimes there's ones that go in the middle that start with a colon. Yes?
What's your take on the fact that we now are using a template type? I mean, it seems like we've gone full circle. It used to be very popular, and
Yeah.
everyone was excited about JSX because it was really Java or JavaScript. And
Yeah.
do you think it limits it in any way?
There's a benefit that it adds, and I have a slide explicitly on this that's coming up where I'm going to compare the approaches in React and Angular and Vue and Svelte, all on that one slide. Ah, here it is.
Before we do that slide, I have one other
Yeah.
question. I don't think it's a spell question, but I'm not familiar with that syntax on the form. The on::submit is the property, yes?
This is the name of the event, just like I can do on click on a button. On click is the event, submit is the event here, and then this is an event modifier, and there's maybe 3 or 4 of those that Svelte provides. Another one tells it only listen for the first occurrence of an event, so I can do that on a button. I think it's like vertical bar once.
So that prevent default is Svelte, or is that?
Well, prevent default is a DOM thing that you could call on an event, but that's Svelte's shorthand way of doing that for you. Because otherwise I would have to say equals in some function that I wrote up above, and then I'd do that in the function.
I was trying to make that prevent default the standard function from the DOM.
Well, that's what it will do for me. But if I didn't use that and I gave it a function to call on the submit, I could call event.prevent default inside that function.
So in this case, that or syntax is really Svelte?
Yes, that's right. Yes,
That's why I don't
exactly.
understand it, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there are really 3 approaches you could take to doing markup in one of these web frameworks. So let's look at the approaches. In React, you use JSX. And so all your logic is really implemented in JavaScript code, and you just put that in curly braces. And I like that quite a bit. I do that all day long working in React. In Angular and Vue, it's different. They've added special attributes that you add to something in GF and NG4 in Angular, and VF and V4 in Vue. And then in Svelte, you have that mustache-like syntax. So we saw an example of a pound sign each. There's also a pound sign if. So one of the advantages of this is that you could wrap inside it more than one element. But in the other frameworks, you have to have a root element, and then you put stuff inside it. And in the case of React, they have this feature that's called a fragment. And you could just say angle brackets, that's the beginning of a fragment, and then a bunch of elements, and then angle bracket / angle bracket to end it. It's kind of weird. So at least in Svelte, you have this natural way that you could put more than one thing inside one of these mustache kind of syntaxes. But another point about this, taking a look at how it works in Angular and Vue, is that you're adding these to an element, and then you're able to tell it, should it render that? And how many times should it render it? Well, imagine if you could do that same sort of thing in JavaScript in a function call. It might look something like this. I'm trying to call this function do something, and I'm passing it some arguments. But I'd also like to tell it, should you call this? Well, only call it if this is true. And how many times should you call it? Well, loop through this collection and set arg1 to every value in this collection, and then call it again. This is really weird. Right? You wouldn't want to write JavaScript like this. And I would say that the way these work is really kind of similar to that you're attaching your conditional logic and your iteration logic to the thing that it's going to act on. So you could look at that as kind of a benefit of the Svelte approach, that you're not doing that. You have conditional logic and iteration that is around the thing, not right on the thing. So let's look at the if. So it begins with $if and a condition, and this is just a JavaScript expression. So if it's true, then you're going to render the stuff that is inside. And you end it like that, and then in the middle, if you want, you can have an else part, and you can have an else if with just another condition, as many of those as you want. So notice that it begins with a $, ends with a slash, and the things in the middle have a colon, and that same pattern carries over to all of the others. So here's an example of that. If the color is yellow, I want to output this, nice color. If it's orange, that's okay too. And if it's anything else, I want to output that. And just a little bit more detail on the each. I can do this with any iterable. Remember back when ES6 came out and we were all excited about iterables and generators and all that stuff, and then we moved past it a couple of years and now nobody thinks about that? Like, have you implemented a custom iterable? I thought we were going to be doing that, but it turned out no. So when you see iterable, it almost always just means it's an array. The each ends like that, and it can have an optional else. And that's interesting because that lets you specify what it should render in case your iterable is empty. So there's an example of that coming up down here. But here's a very simple one. I'm going to loop through an array of colors, and I want to output this for each one. But notice that I've got curly braces doing interpolation for the value of this style attribute, which makes it actually use the color when it outputs it. In this one, I'm showing that you can also get an index of the things that you're iterating through, and I could use that so that I could output numbers in front of them with a paren after it. Of course, it's zero-based indexes, and that's why I've got to add it in there. And then here's my example with the else. I'm iterating through a collection of people. Those are objects, and so I can do destructuring right here to pull out the name and age values, and then I'll output this div. But what if I don't have any people? I can say with the else, in that case, I want to say this, there are no people. And so I don't need to add an if around it and check whether it's empty. I can do that just with the else that goes with the each.
Can you see the curly braces within the HTML? Is that truly any type of JavaScript that you want to inject at that point?
Just like React, it's any JavaScript expression.
Any expression?
Yeah, right.
Yes.
That's right. And then if the curly brace has a pound sign after it, then it's one of these special things.
Any valid JavaScript syntax could be used in that.
Right, including calling a function and then outputting.
Kind of maybe mitigates the concern for the template language maybe not being as robust as, hitting a roadblock somewhere where you can't do something from there because there is really JavaScript snippets
Right.
inside of it.
Yeah, I would say the only limiting factor there is that in React you like that because that JavaScript function you called could be returning JSX, which gets rendered, but that's not so easy to do in Svelte. So you generally don't write functions that are returning HTML. I said that there are 3 of these special things. We've seen 2 of them. We've seen each and we've seen if, and here's the third one, really cool. It's await. And so this is for working with promises, and usually what you're going to do here is give it a function, a call to a function that is returning a promise. And then you can tell it, hey, I'm waiting for that thing to resolve, but before it resolves, render this. And then when it resolves, give me the result, and then I'll tell you what to render when it's successful. But if it rejects instead of resolving, I'll end up down in the catch, and I'll get an error, and I'll tell you how to render the error. That's really nice that I get all 3 of these. You don't usually see that in the frameworks, to be able to tell it what to do until it resolves or rejects. I don't have to use all of these pieces, and in fact, if I don't want to tell it what to render while I'm waiting, if I don't want to render anything, I can take this then result part and just move it up to here. And so I render this when it resolves, render this when it rejects, and if it hasn't done either yet, I don't render anything. So that's a quick run through of a lot of the features of Svelte. And now what I want to do is break it down to what I think are the top features in Svelte and explain each of these to you. So the one that gets a lot of press is that Svelte generates really small bundles, and that means that your application is going to download really quickly compared to the other frameworks. Your component definitions are defined in a single file, and it's the file that determines what is all a part of that as opposed to some other kind of wrapper. CSS is scoped to the component by default. And of course, you probably want to have some global CSS as well. If you want to say that every button in my application should have a green border, then I have a clear place to put that kind of CSS. Managing component state that is just for that component is really easy, and that's something that Svelte calls reactivity. Managing state across all my components using stores is really easy. If I need to pass some data from some ancestor component down many layers to a descendant component, that's really easy using Svelte's version of context. We saw reactive declarations earlier. That was the $: that makes something execute again. If anything, it depends on changes. Two-way data bindings. We saw an example of that with just a text input. I'll show a few more examples like that. There's some built-in animation support that's just incredibly easy to make parts of your UI animate. And then if you do things that are bad for accessibility, Svelte will catch a lot of that for you and warn you about it. And an example of that would be if you have an image tag that doesn't have an alt attribute, it's going to flag that for you. So let's go through each of these one at a time. Small bundle sizes. So this doesn't mean that Svelte actually executes fast once it's all downloaded. It just means that it downloads really quick because it's so small. I mentioned earlier that it uses rollup for module bundling by default. You can change it to use Webpack or Parcel if you want to. And then you run npm run build, and that generates the bundle.js file for you. If you go out to this website, they wrote a non-trivial app, not like my to-do app, in a bunch of frameworks, and they built them for deployment, not for development use, but they tried to get it all optimized as much as they could, and they came up with these numbers for the size. And you could see that it's really striking. This number is so far away from all of those. It's like order of magnitude difference. Some people say that the Svelte framework disappears from your finished app, but that's not actually true. It just mostly disappears. And so the way this works is that if you look at where the Svelte library is installed under node modules, you'll see there's a bunch of JavaScript files there. The main one is this one, internal.js, but there's these others that may have pieces of them used depending on what capabilities of Svelte you're using. But then you create your bundle directory. It's going to go into the public directory, and that will be the name of it. And you can open that up and look at the generated code, and you'll see that at the beginning of that file is all the code that it pulled from internal.js and some of these that you need for your application. And it can have just the parts that you need because it's a compiler. It looked at all your code and it determined what you needed. And so it turns out that when you write an application like my to-do app, it doesn't need very much. And it's only about 500 lines of code that belong to Svelte, and all the rest is my code. So it doesn't completely disappear. It's just incredibly small compared to the other frameworks. File-based component definition. So how do you define a component in Angular? Well, you always define a class, almost always in TypeScript, and that's the container for the component. In React, these days, you rarely use classes anymore. You can if you want, but most people define components as a function, and that function is the container for your component. In Vue, you have this object literal that describes what are the props and what are the methods and what are the computed properties and all those things. It's a big object literal that defines the component. But in Svelte, there's no kind of JavaScript container. As you saw, it's just a source file that has a script section and a style section and a bunch of HTML down at the bottom. And so the Svelte compiler says, I'm going to take everything from that file and combine it together, and that's the component. So I really like it that I don't have to have some sort of container. It's just whatever's in the file. we saw earlier that you don't give a name to your component. The name gets associated when somebody imports it to use it. And when they do that, they do have to give it a name that starts with an uppercase letter, and that's because lowercase names are reserved for HTML and SVG, those kind of standard things. I said that the CSS is scoped by default, and the way that this works is that it generates a hash specific to your component, and then it puts Svelte dash in front of it, and then it's going to add this as a class name to all the elements that get rendered for your component. And then the CSS that it generates has that class as a part of it, and so it only hits your components. That doesn't mean that CSS from outside the component can't change it. If you give a class to, say, a div inside your component, well, that's still visible. It also has this, but you can just target the class that you gave it from that global CSS file if you need to override something. And here's where that file is. When you start out your application, you've already got this, and so that's the place where you put all the global things. With a lot of other frameworks, you have to think, where would I like CSS? But it's already defined for you here. Svelte has an ESLint plugin that will find CSS that's in your components that you're not actually using. Clean that up if over time you stop using some of it. Managing state within the component is really easy. So we already saw an example of this where I was watching my array of to-dos and I was watching the text inside a component. Here's an even simpler example. So imagine writing this same thing in whatever framework you're using now and think about how many more lines of code you'd have to write. So this is just a really simple counter. Remember, any top-level variable is the state. So count is my state. It starts at 0. I've got a function that when I call it, it bumps up the count by 1. I don't have any CSS, but I'm going to render count equals in the current count. And if I click this button that just has a plus on it, I call increment and I'm done. Because if I call this, it'll bump up the count. That's my state, so this is going to re-render. There's just, I can't conceive of how this could get any simpler. I think we're done simplifying because there's nothing left to remove. So you do have to assign a new value to trigger that. But I said earlier that arrays are kind of a special thing here, that you can't just modify the existing array. You've got to create a new one. And so I could use concat to add a value like that and assign it back in. I could also use the spread operator and create a new array that has everything that I had before, plus I'm adding this one. And then there's this interesting trick. I actually can do a push as long as I follow it up by assigning this thing back to itself. Why does that work? I'm thinking that this must be something that Svelte is looking for. It's a really special case, and it's so odd, I'm not sure I would actually do it. But at the same time, I'm guessing that that would actually be the most efficient of these options, because I'm not creating a new array. I'm just signaling to Svelte that, yeah, I did make a change that you should look at. So that is just managing state within a component. But what if I want to have some state that is outside my components that multiple components can get to? And the way I do that is using what Svelte calls a store. And I'm sure you're familiar with that concept in some other frameworks. You can have Redux stores, and Vue has Vuex that are just different kinds of stores. But in Svelte, the way this works is that you can define your stores anywhere you want, but if it's a kind of a store that you want to be available to any component, a lot of people will create this file called stores.js, and inside there you create the stores and export them, and you can have as many as you want. They could hold just an integer, just a string, an object, an array, or a function, anything you want, and then components that want to use it would import it out of stores.js. I might have a case, though, where I want to restrict who can get to the store. So I might create it in this one component, and it should only be available to descendants of that component and not the rest of the UI. Well, all I have to do in that case is put my store into the context of that parent component, and now any of the ancestors can get to it through the context. And we're going to see how context works in just a bit here. So using a store like this is an alternative to passing data down through my hierarchy of components through props, or using context that we're going to see in just a bit. So there are three kinds of stores you can create: writable, readable, and derived. So writable, as you might guess, means other components can get to the data, and they can change it too. And if they do change it, any other component that's using it is going to re-render and use the new values. So once I've created it, I can call set on my writable store and give it a new value. So if that was holding an array, I'd give it a new array. If it was an object with a bunch of nested objects inside, I would give it a brand new top-level object as its new value. I can also call update, in which case I give it a function that will be past the current value, and I can use that to compute the new value and return that. A readable store is usually used in a context where it's going to know enough to compute its value at any time, and it can update itself, but other components that use it, they're just reading from it. And so they will be notified if changes are made, but it's the store itself that is making those updates. And then derived means that I want to build on top of some other stores and pull together data from multiple of them. I don't think that one would be used nearly as often, and probably most common is to use a writable store. So here's what that would look like. I go to this package Svelte.js/store, and I pull in writable, and then I call that, and I pass it what I want the starting value to be. So I want to have a store that holds descriptions of dogs, and it starts out as just an empty array. And now any component can import from stores.js and specifically import the dog store, and then they'll be able to call set on that to add dogs to it, or use update to do that. They could remove dogs as well, and then if I have multiple components looking at this store, they'll all stay in sync through that. Here's a fancier kind of writable store where I can pass it an initial value, but I can also pass it a function. And that function is going to be given a set function. And so now this can call set whenever it figures out what it is it wants the value to be. And so what I'm doing is I'm using the fetch API, and I'm going to hit this URL of this REST service, and I'm using await. That's why I made this async. It doesn't have to be async, but in my case, I want to use await, and that's why I did that. So I get some data back from that REST service, and then because it's the fetch API, I've got to make one more call and get the result as JSON. I've got to await that as well, because both of these are returning promises. And now I finally have my data, and I call set, that function that was passed into me. And so now my store has its value. And then optionally, I could return a function that will be called whenever the subscriber count goes to 0. So we're going to see, I think, on the next slide, how does a component subscribe to changes to a store, and how could they unsubscribe when they're done? And then that's how this would know that, hey, nobody else is listening to this now, and so it could do any cleanup it wants to do. Most of the time, you don't need to do any cleanup, though. Okay? So these examples are the same, except for in this case, I'm using that optional data, some other source, like calling a REST service. Well, now that I've got my store created, I want to make use of it, and you have two choices, the hard way and the easy way. You're never going to use the hard way, but it's interesting to see what the steps are and what's being done for you if you choose the easy way. So the hard way is that you're going to use the subscribe method. So here I'm pulling my dog store in from stores.js. That's what we just looked at on the previous slide. And I'm also going to get access to this lifecycle function from Svelte. And then I have this top-level variable dogs. And so that is going to be the state of this component that we're inside. And I want to set that to whatever is in the dog store. So I subscribe to the dog store, and I give it a function that it's going to call anytime the store changes. So it will give me the new value, and I'll just set dogs to be that value. And because this is the state of my component, I can use dogs down in the HTML. I could use the #each and iterate through the dogs and render them. That's going to re-render every time this changes, and that changes every time the store says its value changed. Now, subscribe returns an unscribe function to me, and so I can say if this component instance is ever destroyed, which means it was removed from the DOM, I want to call that unsubscribe. So I'm all set up now. I've subscribed. I'll unsubscribe when I need to. I can use dogs. The simpler thing to do is to just grab the dog store. Don't subscribe. Don't unsubscribe. When I want to refer to it, just put a $sign in front of the name. And Svelte looks at that and it says, okay, the first time I hit a reference to that, I guess you want to subscribe. And when the component gets unmounted or destroyed, I guess you want to unsubscribe. And it just does it for you. So auto subscription is really what you want to use. Really easy to pass data from some component down to one of its descendants. All you have to do is go to the Svelte package and pull in get context and set context. Now, this is quite a bit different than context in React. It's quite a bit easier. An ancestor component can call set context, and you give a name to this thing, whatever you want to call it, and then whatever you want the value to be. Now you have to do this during your component initialization. And what that means is that you can't do it inside a function of your component that maybe gets called when the user clicks a button. This has to happen when your component first gets mounted. And one of the things that implies is that this is not a mechanism for passing dynamic data down to descendants. It's just data that you'll know as soon as the component gets created. If you want it to be dynamic, you should be using the stores instead. Okay, and then down in some descendant component, I call get context and I give it a matching key and it gives me the value. And what it does is it looks to see, does my parent have it? No. Does its parent? Does it parent? And it just walks all the way up the tree until it can find something that set the context for that key and gets the value for you. So I'll show an example of that on the very next slide, but I want to point out that those keys, I think usually it's going to be a string, but technically it can be any kind of value. So as long as what you use to set it matches what you use to get it, it will work. And of course the values can be anything you want. It can be a string, an array, an object, a function, whatever you want to pass down. But another big difference between stores and context is that context is not reactive. The parent or the ancestor component that set it can't change it later and expect that descendant components are going to see that change. You need to use stores if you want that. So here's a quick example. I've got this component that I'm calling A just by the file name, and it's pulling in set context, and then I'm going to import the B component that is down here, and then I'm going to set context, and I call it favorites, and it's an object that has my favorite color and my favorite number. And then I'm just going to render, yeah, I'm in A right now. That renders out this line. And then I want to render my B component. The B component doesn't care about favorites. It's just importing C, which is this component, and it renders out this is in B, which is this line right here. And then I render a C component. The C component, 2 levels down, is the one that cares about that context. And so I'm going to pull in get context, and I'm going to see if I can find a thing called favorites. So it's going to look in its parent B. It's not there. So it looks up in A, and it finds it. And so it pulls down that object, and I'm going to use destructuring and pull out those values. And now I can say this is C, and the favorite color is yellow, and the favorite number is 19. So really easy to get data from some ancestor down to any descendant. It's just that it's not dynamic. It's not reactive. So we saw examples of reactive declarations, but there's a bit more I can say about that. So it's just a JavaScript label whose name happens to be a $sign. And I use that as a prefix only on top-level statements in the component. I can't use it nested inside some function. And so in this example, if the value of total or the value of count changes, I'm going to recompute the value of average, and maybe I'm rendering that inside this component. This is an interesting one for debugging purposes. I'm having some problem with the value of count, and I want to do some debugging. And so I say, if anything in this line changes, do this again, which is just print the value every time it changes. I can apply that to a block of code, so I don't have to do it to every line. I could have a bunch of statements in here, and if anything I reference there changes, rerun the entire block. I could apply it to an if statement, and if something changes there, rerun the if statement. Two-way data binding. So we saw an example of that with a text input earlier. It kind of simulates two-way data binding. I say simulate because if you look at the generated code, it actually is adding in all the event handling for you to make it work. Nothing really magic there. So it's giving you the current value of a thing and giving you event handling to update it if the user makes a change. So I wanted to run through the common scenarios where you'd want to use this to show how easy this is. So we'll start off with a very basic text input. Then we have a single checkbox, got a bunch of checkboxes. The difference here, the reason why I'm showing a version where I have multiple, is that these are associated with each other, and I want the value here to be an array of strings that tell me what are all the ones you've checked, as opposed to just a variable that is a Boolean, true or false. The radio buttons, I'm going to pick a single value. This select or drop down, I'll pick a single value, and then I have a text area. And then down here, I'm just rendering all the values that you've selected. So these are all the common cases you'd care about. So down in the JavaScript for this component, I have this array of colors, an array of flavors, an array of seasons, and now I want to create all of this UI. The state for this component is all of these variables, and so you see the values that they start off with. I want to especially point out flavors. Remember I said that's all the ones I've selected because those are the checkboxes. Okay? So I want to bind to all of those variables that represent the state of this component.
State is because it's mutable, the declaration.
Yes, and because it's a top-level variable. Right.
But constants wouldn't be considered a state.
That's right. Yeah, because it knows you can't change it. Okay. So now I want to render all those form components. So they all have a label in front of them. My input for text, I say bind : value. Value is the property of the input that tells it what to render. And so I give it the name property, and it's bound to that. The checkbox, I bind to the checked property. Here, I'm looping through all the flavors and creating a separate checkbox for each one. And instead of saying bind checked, I say bind group. And that tells it I want to have an array of all the values for all the checkboxes. They're all going to this same array. For the radio buttons, I'm looping through all the seasons. I create a radio button, and then I use bind group. But in this case, it's going to be a single value. It knows that's a radio button, and I just want to know which one have they selected. For a drop-down created with a select, here I've got an empty option at the beginning. You don't have to have that, but I want it to be possible to not have anything selected. And so that's that. And then I'm looping through all the colors and creating a separate option for each one. And then I want to bind to the value property of the select and set favorite color. So when you pick one, it's going to set that. And then text area, again, bind to the value and set story. So now everything is wired up, and all I have to do is render the things that you saw right here. And all it is using interpolation to get to the values of those state variables. So very easy to set up two-way binding. I mentioned that it's really easy to set up animation in Svelte, and I won't go into a lot of detail here, but you see the names of some of the things that it provides and what you have to import them from. But just to show you how easy it is, I wanted to make my to-do list set up so that if I add a brand new to-do, it doesn't just throw the new checkbox out there for me, but it actually fades into place. And if I delete it, I want it to fade out. All I have to do is import fade from Svelte transition and tell the list item that it should use that transition of fade, and I'm done. And it does all the work for me. So Svelte is not perfect. And I would say that the number one issue with Svelte now is that it doesn't yet support TypeScript. It is itself written in TypeScript, but you can't write your components in TypeScript. You might write some JavaScript files that are part of your Svelte app that are not components. They're just collections of JavaScript functions, and you can use TypeScript for those. But they are working on this. There's an issue that you see referenced there. No clear indication of how soon they think they'll have that done, but they do realize that this is a major issue. For some people, this would be the one thing that would convince them to not use Svelte yet and wait until that is in place. In terms of popularity, well, clearly Svelte has not yet risen to the level of being as popular as React and Vue and Angular, but I'm hearing it mentioned an awful lot lately. And a lot of people will mention it as a fourth thing when they're listing off current web frameworks. So I think it's safe to say that it is the number 4 framework now. You could be concerned that if you decide to use it on a project, you'll have trouble finding developers that know it. But really, how hard is it? We just did this in less than an hour, and you know most of what you need to know to use it. And so it's not that hard for developers to come up to speed on it. One of the guys that creates that, what's the podcast I just mentioned? Syntax, yeah, Syntax. He creates a lot of online courses, and he's decided it's important enough that he should create a course and sell it. So yeah, it's getting a lot of traction. So if you want to get started with this, here are the steps. So first of all, of course, you've got to install Node.js, and that's going to give you Node and NPM and also NPX. I wasn't really in the habit of using NPX very much. I had heard of it, but I've been using it a bit more lately. And one of the cool things about NPX is that if you install something locally in your project, it's down in a bin directory under Node modules, and you can't just run it directly unless you give the path to it. But with NPX, it will look there automatically for you. So, another thing that it does is it will go out to NPM and grab the code to run something for you so that you don't even have to initially download it. Well, Rich Harris created this thing called dget. And so if you want to run it, it's in NPM, but you don't have to download it. You can just say npx dget, and then you give it a GitHub username and a GitHub repo, and it will download the master branch of that for you, and it will store it in a directory with whatever name you provide right there. So he has a starter template for Svelte right there. This pulls down the master branch of that, the latest version of it, and now you've got your starting point. Another way that you could do it is go to svelte.dev/REPL, and let me show you what that looks like. So that's right here, and this is really cool because you can type in code for Svelte components here, and you can have more than one, so I can add one here. And if I actually log in with an account on this thing, it can save all my stuff out there, and I don't even have to have any local files. And I can take a look at what it generated in terms of JavaScript and CSS, and I can run my app right here in the browser, and I don't even have anything local. And then when I get it to a point that I like it, I can download it right there. Okay, but if I visit the REPL and I don't even type in any code and I just immediately download, I'm getting that same starter template. And so that's maybe an even easier way. Just visit this website, hit that button, and you've got your starting point. Then once you've got that, you go down into the directory of this app name you're creating, run an npm install to install the dev dependencies, and then npm run dev. There's also an npm run start, and the difference is that start doesn't give you live reload, and dev does. You want the live reload, so when you make changes to the code, it'll refresh in the browser. One of the things that was a little hard to get used to at first is the idea that if I type a syntax error in my code and I save it, I don't see an indication that that happened in the browser. The browser window just goes blank. And why does it do that? And can't they make it better? Well, the reason is, remember I said that Svelte is a compiler. And so that compiler is running out in a terminal window. And when it saw the syntax error, it could not build a bundle for me. And so it couldn't run it in the browser to show me something. So that means that you kind of want to have your terminal window where this is running visible so you can see when you've added a syntax error.
Doesn't it show up in the console?
You know, when I first started working with Svelte, I would say no, it doesn't show up there. But more recently, it seems like I see some errors there, but maybe not all.
I ran one of your projects, and I noticed the same thing. You know, my screen was blank, I had invalid syntax. But I saw
Yeah. So I guess there's some errors that are worse than others, or that it's able to handle now and at least write something to the console. So once you start this up, then you browse localhost :5000. It doesn't pop it up automatically for you. I wish it would do that. And then it's just going to render hello world, and I think it's in blue or purple text, something like that. So it's not a very fancy starting point, but at least you've got all the tools set up for you. So there's things that I have not covered in this talk that if you want to know more, you can go to that URL. And you don't need to write that down, because if you go to my GitHub repo and go into talks, you can find these slides and find that again. But it's a long article I wrote about Svelte that covers these additional things. And so that first one there, if you've got a string of HTML, how do you get that to render? So there's some special syntax to make that work. Slots are a way that you could write a component that can have children that you specify when you use it. And those children should be rendered somewhere inside the component. Lots of web frameworks have a slot feature. React calls those children. Event details. So we saw some examples of event handling. You saw that prevent default modifier. There's a few more modifiers that you could learn about, and learn a bit more about how you can create custom events and dispatch them. These events that go from a child component just up to the parent. We saw the onDestroy lifecycle function, but there's also onMount that you might use if you, for example, want to make a REST call when your component is first rendered to grab some data. And then when changes happen, you can hook into the lifecycle and do something before your component updates or after it updates. I really think of all of these, onMount is by far the most common, and you may very rarely use the rest of them. Actions are a way that you can tell an element that you're rendering that when it is added to the DOM, you want something special to happen. And a good example of this is that if I have a component that renders an input form component, and I want to move focus to it automatically, I can add an action to the input, and then it'll be passed a reference to that DOM node, and then it can ask for focus to move to it. We didn't say anything about routing. In a lot of applications, I don't think you really need a routing library. You could have your top-level component be looking at a store value that tells you what page you're looking at right now. Then any component in the app could change that in the store. And if your top-level component is looking at that and has conditional logic to say, if my route is login, render the login component. If my route is dashboard, render the dashboard component. So in a lot of cases, very simple routing like that works out fine. When it doesn't is when you really care about the URL of each page, and you want the user maybe to be able to change the URL, and that takes them to a different page, or to be able to bookmark a page. In that case, maybe you will want to use real routing. And there's a library on NPM called Page that some people use for this that makes it really simple. Or another option is to use something that sits on top of Svelte called Sapper. So Sapper gives you built-in routing. It gives you server-side rendering if you want to render all your components from the server instead of having this code running on the client. And it does some work to strip out more code that you don't need.
Is Page specific to Svelte?
It is not. It's a general purpose library that people have used with Svelte to get routing.
Have you any experience with Cyber?
I have not. I haven't looked into it yet. I've not really worked on any applications where I've felt it was important to have server-side rendering. So if I did, or if I had complex routing needs, then I suppose it would be nice to use Sapper as my starting point instead of Svelte, so I already have those things. But I haven't had that need yet. Module context is a way that a component can say, here's some code that is not associated with each instance of the component, but it's associated with all of them. Think of it like static values inside a class. It belongs to all the instances. There's some special Svelte elements that you can use. And the most interesting of these, I think, is Svelte:component, where you give it an expression that identifies which component you want to render. And so you can be very dynamic about which component should be rendered at a certain point. We talked about using the reactive declarations for doing some debugging and just throwing a console log after a $::. But another way is to use this @debug. You can give it a list of your state variables that you care about. And if any of them change, it will output their value in the DevTools console, and it will break. And then you can jump into the debugger. If you don't give it a list of variables, if any state in your component changes, it will stop. You can write unit tests using Jest and Svelte, and in my article I go into detail about how you set up both of those. So Svelte is a library that you use in conjunction with Jest that makes it easier for testing Svelte components. And then for end-to-end test, you can write Cypress test. I really love the Cypress framework. It makes it so that you can write tests that are from the perspective of a user, where you could say, type this into the username field, type this into the password field, click the login button. Now you should have a page that contains this. Now do this, now do that. And so it's not specific to the framework.
Does that offer you a way to identify components that aren't relying on the style names? Because when you have those dynamically generated style names with the hash, I would think that.
Yeah, I think what you would do in that case is that you just need to assign a CSS class to them yourself. In addition, they'll get the generated one with the hash, but you've given it one that you can reference from test.
Just for the purpose of those things.
Right, yeah. And another cool feature is that if you're interested in web components and you're working in other frameworks, it actually is possible to implement a component in Svelte and have it generate a custom element that you could use in an application that you've written in another framework like Angular or React or Vue. So some related tools, we talked just a bit about Sapper, kind of similar to Next and Gatsby and some of the things that it provides, gives you routing, server-side rendering, and code splitting. There's a VS Code extension for Svelte that helps you out with syntax highlighting, and it has some IntelliSense related to Svelte. Svelte Native is a project to let you write mobile applications using Svelte. It is based on NativeScript-Vue, so following the work that was done in the Vue community. Svelte testing library I mentioned, and then Storybook works with Svelte. Storybook is a framework for letting you demonstrate your UI components, and it has several purposes. One is to be able to quickly show a client, here's some components we've developed for you so far. What do you think about the way these look? Another use is for debugging your components. Sometimes you might have a really large application and something's going wrong in a particular component. But to test that, you've got to log in, then navigate to this page, then select this thing from this list, and then click this button, and now you see your component. And it's not working. And so you make a change, the browser refreshes, do it all again just to get back to this component with the problem. But if you had put it in Storybook, there's a left nav that lists all the components in your application. You just click it and go straight to that component. You don't have to navigate through the whole app. So here's some resources you might want to look into. The first one is that talk I mentioned by Rich Harris, where he goes into some detail on why he doesn't want to have a virtual DOM and more things about Svelte. And then a lot of this are just different pages that are at the main Svelte website, including that REPL I talked about, where you can get a starting point for your project. The Discord chat room has been really helpful to me so far. You know, isn't that a thing that people always say about a new technology? They say, I'm tired of this old one because the people in that community, they're really rude. But there's this new thing and everybody is so nice. And then a year or two later, now that community is rude, and this brand new one that you just heard about, that's what nice people are. So we're at the stage now where the nice people are still in this chat room. Okay. So conclusion, I think Svelte is a very worthy alternative to using these other popular frameworks, and definitely check out my long article to get more detail about this. So what questions do you have for me? Definitely.
Part of the bundle.
Right, it just doesn't start with them, but you definitely can add anything you want there.
So in that regard,
Right, yeah. Or they could actually already be Svelte components and you just use them, but yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Is there a popular third-party component library that's Svelte-based?
I'm not aware of one yet. I think that's just a matter of the age of Svelte, that there hasn't been enough activity around that yet.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes?
So when something is dispatched in slide 9 or 10, you showed how it's caught by the parent. So if by mistake if I declare that twice or in two other places, will it just give a compilation error or pick the first one?
I think it's going to go to all of them. So you're saying that if more than one place in the parent is listening for the same event and the child emits it, what will happen in the parent? So I'd have to try this, but I'd be really surprised if the answer isn't that they all get fired. Anybody who's listening should get fired that that thing happened.
Can the parent emit events down to the children?
It cannot. The events only go up.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. If you want to pass something down to a child, the main way would be to use a prop. And if it's deeper and you know the value when the component first is created, then you would use context to pass it down. And if it's something that has to happen more at runtime, then you'd use a store for that.
Gotcha. Sorry, go ahead.
So, Adam, you commented on something. This is back in 2016. So you talk about how like Svelte application is the code is very small, the file size is small. But is that if you declare a lot of components, and then the code becomes a lot longer?
Yeah, you would think that the percentages would change, and the larger your application is, the closer it might be to the size of some other framework.
Right. So he argued that the best use case for Svelte is actually for shipping web components, like doing full-side applications. And this is back in 2016, so I wonder if that has changed.
Yeah, so for me, while it's interesting to have a small bundle size and it's going to make my app start up faster, if that wasn't true and it was the same bundle size as, say, React, I would still want to use this just because of how easy it is to define components. And when you think about the other frameworks and how they all have come up with different ways of managing state, you've got NGRX and Angular, you've got Redux and MobX and React, and you've got Vuex and Vue. And here, the concept of stores and context is just so simple. I don't think anyone's going to ever write a state management library for Svelte, because why would you? It's already simple enough. So there's a lot of reasons why I would choose Svelte even if it didn't have a small bundle
The other
size.
thing I would say is the raw speed of the reactive approach built into your code. And maybe that's dependent on the type of application that you're using. But I mean, I think in my opinion, from what I've seen of it so far, that would be a very compelling thing.
Right. I would say in the case of React with the virtual DOM, and in case you're not familiar with how that works, every time React thinks a component might need to be re-rendered, it's going to generate a version of the DOM for that component in memory. And if this is not the first time it's done it, it already has the previous one. And then it can do a diff between these in-memory data structures and figure out what actually changed, and then just update the part of the DOM that changed. And so the claim is that this is much faster than re-rendering the entire DOM, and of course that's true. But that was a lot of work it did to determine that. So imagine that I've got a page that's pretty full of different stuff, and there's an input in the middle of it, and the user is typing. In a typical React application, every keystroke causes that to happen again. Generate the whole DOM for this component again, do the diffing, what changed, update that. Okay, now they typed another key, do it all over again. And so the claim in React, and it's mostly been true for me, is why should you care? It's so fast. You don't need to be aware of all that work that's going on behind the scenes. But maybe you should care, and that's Rich Harris's assertion, is that that's ridiculous to be doing all that work. And by having a compiler for your app, he can generate code that is watching the things that might change, and he doesn't have to do DOM diffing to figure out what changed. He knows exactly what values changed.
Well, he points out too that, what is fast enough? Typically your React type application is going to be very fast, but you're working on a high-end computer, and one of the things that Rich talked about was using Svelte in very low-end devices
Mm-hmm.
that, couldn't handle all this massive work that you just described.
Yeah, that is a really good point.
That makes me wonder how well it would run on like Raspberry Pis or microcomputers. So I know that I've done some like JavaScript applications running on those, and sometimes just running npm install is horrible on its own, but then you also see some slowdown in some of the UI interfaces. So it makes me wonder how, like, if there'd be a noticeable difference.
Yeah.
So yeah, cool. I know that some of the downsides that you brought up were not having TypeScript support and like maybe like a smaller community than the other tools that we're comparing it to. But as far as like a practical everyday development kind of stuff like that, are there any particular snags that you run into, like in any language? I feel like there's always like something that's just like well, that's just part of what you deal with.
Yeah.
Where the counters.
Yeah, so I've been doing a fair amount of this recently, just trying to keep my skills sharp in this. And one of the things I've found kind of annoying is that not only do you not have TypeScript, but there's not the equivalent of React's prop types. So I can't say what kind of thing I should be receiving as a prop. And I feel like I really want to say, hey, this prop is a function, or something like that, and I can't do it. And so you really just have to trust that you're being passed the right kind of things for now until it has TypeScript support. But that hasn't bitten me much yet, but it's bound to at some point. And then I'll be doing debugging to figure out why did I get an object when it was supposed to be an array or whatever. Any other questions? Yes?
So you touched upon how you could potentially write part of lab and take the compiled output and integrate with React. Sorry, could you explain?
Yeah, so I don't know a lot of detail about this. I just know that there's a mode for running the compiler where you could run it on a component and have it generate a JavaScript file, which really is a web component. And some other framework could import that file in and use it like a web component. What I can't tell you is, what is it like to use a plain web component, say, inside an Angular app? I haven't done that before. My understanding is that it works just fine, but I don't have experience in that part of it yet. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much for coming tonight.